Hello, ladies and gentlemen, lads and lasses, and welcome back to the second part of What If Everything Went Perfect for the Soviet Union. If you haven't seen the first part, the link will be in the description below, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Here's a quick recap. The Russian Revolution goes perfectly for the Soviets to the point where they control Finland, all of Turkish Armenia, and most importantly, Poland, which allows the Soviets to expand their influence all across Eastern Europe until they eventually start a revolution in Germany, which leads to an alternate World War II starting. At this point in the war, the Soviets would go into the same sort of strategic stalemate that Germany did in World War II after conquering Poland, France, and the Balkans in our timeline before Operation Barbarossa started. While the stalemate goes on, the war starts to shift from mainland Europe to the British Isles, where the Battle of Britain would start. In China, who would be facing some setbacks from fighting against the Japanese, would still be in a way better position than they were in our timeline. At this point, the Japanese and the Chinese would have been fighting each other with little support from both of their sides, since the Soviets and the British would have been mainly focused on fighting each other in mainland Europe up until the communists kicked them out. Now that that theater of the war is over, supply routes are created by the Soviets and the British to fund their respective sides in Asia better. Along with funding the Chinese, the Soviets would start moving troops to help the CCP, and they would also be focusing on putting down resistance movements like Germany did during World War II in our timeline, though they would have much more support from the locals compared to our timeline, so it wouldn't be as bad as what the Germans had to deal with in our timeline. But the main thing that they would have to do is taking the time to consolidate Europe. Now that the Soviets are in a very unique position, because never has a nation controlled all of Europe before, minus Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, and Britain, and they are also not stuck in the position that the Germans were in, where they were fighting two fronts against two great powers. Instead, they're fighting against one great power, or two if you count Japan. To take advantage of this point in the war, the Soviets would begin to consolidate the control over Western Europe. In Germany, the communists would take full control over Germany, which would be loyal to Moscow, and they would regain control over the Rhineland, as well as Luxembourg, and potentially even the Netherlands, and northern Belgium, since there would no longer be any need for a buffer state between Germany and France, and the Netherlands and northern Belgium are very similar to the Germans from what I've heard at least. They would also do a land transfer with the Soviets, where the Soviets would give up the Polish corridor and the free city of Danzig in exchange for the Polish parts of the East Prussian region, so that way they have direct land access to it again. The Soviets could also further gain the support from the Germans by doing what the Germans did during the Anschluss and heavily influencing the Austrians to vote in favor of joining Germany, while also forcing Chechnya to give them the Sudetenland, which will leave the Soviets with an extremely powerful ally that would heavily support them and also like them by having the support of not only the German communists, but now also the German nationalists who wanted to control all of Germany's natural borders as well. In France, the French Communist Party that was loyal to the Soviets would gain full control over France and would also gain southern Belgium. In Scandinavia, Norway and Denmark would be fully annexed by Sweden, reuniting the Kalmar Union. And in Italy, a pro-Soviet communist government would also gain full control over Italy, but would lose Slovenia and Albania, who wanted to gain independence from Italy, but would still have pro-Soviet governments installed in them. In Spain, they would get installed with a pro-Soviet communist government and would annex Portugal, as well as Andorra, who would get conquered at some point during the war, as well as Gibraltar, if they managed to take it from the British. In Turkey, the Soviets would get Istanbul, Bulgaria would get some of the European territory that's around Istanbul, and Greece would get the Greek, Russian parts of Turkey. The Soviets would help the Kurdish rebels consolidate and form an independent Kurdish government that would be aligned with the Soviets. Then what's left of Turkey would be a communist puppet rump state, and last of all, the Soviets would help Cyprus break away from Britain and destroy Britain's naval bases there, and then Cyprus would be integrated into Greece's territory. Moving over to Free France, and in Free France in our timeline, a French general named Charles de Gaulle rallied Free France against the Germans, which helped with the British in the African front of the war. In this timeline, since World War II starts earlier, he wouldn't be a general, he would be lower in rank, so it would either be much harder for him to unite Free France against the Germans, or he wouldn't be able to at all in this alternate timeline. If that happens, either someone else will unite Free France that potentially wouldn't be nearly as competent as Charles de Gaulle, or no one will rise up in this alternate timeline, which is what we will bank on in this alternate scenario. In this scenario, without a leader to unify Free France, there's obviously no united front in Africa to help out the Allies. From there are three options that would happen to each French colony. 1. They recognize a new French communist government. 2. They declare their independence. Or 3. They completely fracture apart. Now, I don't believe that any of these colonies would become communist because there probably wouldn't be that much support for it, just like in our timeline. What would most likely happen is either all or most of the colonies wouldn't be able to form governments and then would quickly fall into anarchy. So not that much different than what ended up happening in our timeline. When that happens, influence would be split between French settlers who would take control over their settlements, which we will mainly see in Algeria, Africans who would see this as an opportunity to gain independence, whatever pro-communists are in Africa at this point, and French military militias that would either stay loyal to or would have broken away from the fallen French Republic. There may be some colonies that would be able to gain independence and successfully form governments, and maybe some sides winning civil wars early, especially in smaller African countries, but it would be impossible to tell what would happen, and that's the point. The Soviets wouldn't want a united Free France to fight against them like what happened in our timeline. They would want them either united under communism or out of the way completely. Also, since the same thing would have happened to Italy, Spain, and Portugal, their colonies would also most likely fall into anarchy as well, except for the Congo, which would be conquered by the British for the resources like what happened in our timeline, as well as Djibouti since it's small and would be a crucial choking point in the Red Sea, as well as maybe even Eritrea to better control the Red Sea. They would not, however, be able to do the same for Free France because there would be way too much territory to gain with too little reward, especially since they would need as much manpower as possible to fight against the Soviets in the Battle of Britain. Instead, they would most likely try to control key port cities and mineral deposits, but other than that, they would have to leave Africa to its own devices. While Europe is being reorganized, the Soviets would reorganize their troops as well. In our timeline during World War II, Germany organized their troops into the Atlantic Wall, which was a series of defenses against Britain that spread from Scandinavia to France to prevent British invasions. In this timeline, the Soviets would build the same defenses, which would extend to the entrance of the Mediterranean now that Spain and Portugal are controlled by them. This will prevent Britain from being able to invade continental Europe. And one other thing that I think would happen is that Britain would allow Japan to gain control over the Dutch East Indies as well as French Indonesia, because since the Netherlands and France would have fallen to the communists, they would want to break away from them. But those territories have plenty of resources that the Japanese could use to try to fight against the Soviets, so that way, the British can focus more of their resources on combating the Soviets in the Battle of Britain. After the consolidation stage of the war, the Soviets will begin to launch the second stage of the war, which will consist of two operations. The first operation will be known as Operation Downfall, which will be against the Japanese. The Soviets would move all their land-based invasion units to the Far East and then invade Manchuria, along with China, who would start their counteroffensive. Now, although the Japanese in our timeline by this point would have made much more gains in China, in this timeline, because China would be much more unified and powerful under the communists, who historically were much more competent than the nationalists, combined with the fact that Japan wouldn't have been invading China for like a decade before World War II even started, they wouldn't be able to make nearly the amount of gains that they have made in our timeline, even though they would be supported by the West. And because they would be supported by the West, the Americans wouldn't have imposed any embargoes on Japan because they would be allied with Britain and would allow them to pass through their Filipino colony to conquer and control their new colonies. With the Soviets focusing a lot of their manpower on fighting against the Japanese, they would end up being kicked out of all of Manchuria, Korea, and even Sakhalin. After that happens, the Soviets will transfer Manchuria to the communists and will puppet Korea. From there, the Chinese will help defend the mainland from potential Japanese counteroffensives, and the Chinese will also continue the Chinese Civil War by beginning to conquer more of Western China, which historically they weren't able to do after World War II. If the Chinese and the Soviets are successfully able to eventually get rid of Japan's control over China, the Japanese might give up completely on trying to conquer China and instead would fall back to more of an American role, supplying the Allies while staying out of the war. If they choose to keep on fighting against China, they would have a much harder time against them because the communists would be more unified and powerful with Soviet backing, compared to the nationalists in our timeline, but the one key advantage that they would have is their naval power, which they would be able to use to potentially gain temporary footholds on China before getting mostly kicked out, while also blocking them out from the Pacific Ocean since they would be surrounded. While all of that's happening, the second operation the Soviets would launch would be called Operation Torch, which, just like the last operation, I definitely did not name after real operations that happened in World War II. Operation Torch would be against Britain's colonial empire, and what would happen in this operation is that the Soviets would take advantage of anti-colonial sentiment in all Britain's colonies, as well as the current situation in Free France, and as well as in Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian colonies, and help form more nationalist movements that will rebel against colonial rule. Now, the goal of these revolutions for the Soviet Union would not be to install puppet governments like they did with all of Europe, but to help them simply break away from Britain, so that way they won't have any access to any of the resources, while also trying to get them to waste the resources by trying to put those rebellions down. By doing that, the independence revolts would have way more local support, and the Soviets wouldn't be able to control all of Africa through puppet kingdoms anyways, because they would already be overstretched in that department because of all the new puppet kingdoms in Western Europe. If the Soviet Union were to be able to successfully get all of Africa to rebel and break away from colonial rule, then Britain would lose access to all of its colonial resources that it would be using to fund its war effort, and the only resources they would have left would be from the home isles, which wouldn't be many. On top of that, all of the allies that Britain would have left other than Japan would be their dominions, who were basically independent, so they wouldn't have to worry about them defecting like the rest of their colonies. And they'd also have America as an ally through them sending their supplies, which means they wouldn't have access to that much external support. During the initial African revolts, the British would do their best to suppress them, but as time goes on, they would keep on becoming a bigger problem, to the point where they would have to start letting go of some of the more minor colonies to redisperse their resources to defend their more important colonies, and most importantly of all, the home isles. As time goes on, the Soviets will set up more and more networks to supply the revolutionaries, to the point where the revolts will continue to become much bigger issues over time, and the British will have to continue to make more and more difficult decisions as time goes on what pawns to sacrifice. I'm sorry for the quick interruption, but by far, most of you guys are not subscribed, which you should definitely do because this is the most underrated alternate history channel on the platform. And at the time of recording, we are just 25 subscribers away from the big 500. If you want me to make a 500 subscriber milestone video, then please let me know in the comments section below and add in your ideas. And without further ado, let's get back to the scenario. Back in China, and during the time when Britain would be struggling to hold onto the holdings in Africa, the Soviets would not only be setting up networks there, but also would be supplying the CCP. The CCP would get a lot more aid from the Soviets a lot earlier than in our timeline, since they wouldn't have to deal with Operation Barbarossa like they had to in our timeline, and also because they would have a much more stable connection with each other earlier on, because China would be much more unified. The Soviets and the CCP would go on to conquer more and more of Western China, and the Soviets would be able to use that territory to make better supply routes to link up with revolutionaries in the British Raj and in Indochina, which would deal massive blows to Britain and Japan if they were to lose them. Eventually, the CCP would be able to reunify all of China, and the Soviets would launch an offensive into the Middle East that would conquer what's left of those colonies, as well as push into Egypt up to the Suez Canal in order to fight against Britain to eventually seize it from them. While that's going on, revolutionary movements would be gaining speed all over the British Empire, which Britain would be struggling to deal with because their main focus, understandably, would be defending the home isles in the Battle of Britain. Over in America's perspective, and they have no way to really enter the war. They wouldn't want to support Britain because doing that would mean helping them put down rebellions in Africa, which they would be against doing because colonialism. And there would also be no way for the Americans and the British to be able to march from Portugal all the way up to Moscow over time. In Asia, the Americans would want to help out there because either the Japanese would be trying to invade China, which they were against in our timeline, and they also wouldn't want to attack Pearl Harbor because the Americans wouldn't be hostile towards them because they would be allies to Britain in this timeline, and would get to all the South Pacific colonies using the naval routes that they now own in the South China Sea through the holdings in South China, Indonesia, and Indochina, instead of needing to go through the Philippines. So yeah, the Americans would just send supplies to their allies for money and eventually take military control over Iceland, and the Soviets wouldn't be worried about ending the war. The Soviets would continue to fund revolutions in the British Raj to the point where they would hand over control of Myanmar to Japan to get them to put down the rebellions instead, while also gaining access to its natural resources. Unfortunately for Japan though, they would lose control over French Indochina to the communist revolutionaries. From there, the Soviets would continue to fund more revolutions in Africa, as well as fighting in the Battle of Britain, which would get increasingly more deadly for the British as the Soviets are able to develop better aerial and naval power over the course of the war. The one thing that they would really need is one decisive way to end the war. During the reconstruction phase of the war, the Soviets decided to gather a large team of all the best scientists across the communist world to develop a top secret weapon that could harness the power of the sun. Eventually, the weapon is successfully created and then deployed to the French coast and the Korean peninsula. These weapons are none other than nuclear bombs. The Soviets, though, originally came up with the concept of a hydrogen nuclear bomb in our timeline, but Stalin originally wanted a full recreation of the American atomic bomb, which was successfully created. However, the next bomb that was created was in fact a hydrogen bomb. Now, the difference between a hydrogen bomb and an atomic bomb is that the first hydrogen bombs that were created were between 450 to 700 times stronger than the American atomic bomb that was created by Oppenheimer. That means that in this timeline, the European scientists would most likely create hydrogen bombs instead, which would be used in warfare and would do 400 to 700 times the damage. So the Soviets load up the nuclear bombs onto the planes in France and Korea, pick out the cities they would drop bombs on, and then strike them. And just like that, in Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and maybe even Tokyo are completely wiped off the map with basically no survivors because of the bomb being between 450 to 700 times stronger than the atomic bombs America dropped in our timeline. In Britain though, it's much worse. The Soviets dropped one hydrogen bomb on London, leaving no survivors, including King George and Queen Elizabeth, who stayed in London to show their solidarity, while the rest of the royal family stayed in Windsor Castle in our timeline, which will most likely be the same in this timeline. Where the next bomb would drop would be the most devastated. The Soviets would evacuate all Soviet airplanes and some of the naval ships from the Battle of Britain, and then detonate a bomb in the English Strait, completely decimating the English Navy. These nuclear attacks would be incomprehensively more deadly compared to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in our timeline, and all the White Axis would have no choice but to surrender. In the peace treaty, which would be deemed the Treaty of Moscow, Britain becomes a Soviet puppet and is divided into England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and the Soviet Union's indisputable control over Europe is recognized, and after Ireland falls to communism through invasion, and Switzerland through most likely a coup, which will lead to them getting partitioned, the Soviet Union will be officially recognized by the title as the first country in the history of mankind to conquer the entire continent of Europe. The remnants of the former British government during the peace treaty were able to make a deal with the Soviets in Canada, which is to allow the evacuation of any British citizen who requests it to Canada. Most British citizens accept this deal and move to Canada, where the biggest humanitarian crisis in history happens. The Dominion of Canada will officially rebrand to Canada, and Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and South Africa would also get rid of their Dominion statuses because they would have no choice but to, since there is no more British Empire, with Canada being deemed the official successor to the British Empire, who would also gain control over all of Britain's overseas islands. Canada would have to rapidly invest in the infrastructure necessary to house all the British citizens, including all that remains of the British family. After the royal family builds a new palace in Ottawa, Princess Elizabeth II will be of age to ascend to the new throne and be crowned as the official Queen of Canada, ensuring the legacy of the British monarchy lives on. Until about 9 years later, when Prince Andrew gets involved in the Epstein situation. British migrants would also move to Australia, New Zealand, and Newfoundland, and all of those countries would adopt aspects of British culture and influence and rebuild what is lost. Where British citizens do stay in the homeland, organize into resistance movements to fight against the Soviets in an attempt to kick them out from the British Isles, which will end up being unsuccessful over time, and eventually it will be completely pacified by the Russians. Also, as part of the deal, in all of the Soviet-occupied countries, anyone can be requested to be transported to Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, and Newfoundland, which will slowly happen over time, leaving nothing left but communist sympathizers over time. For the British to make that deal, it came at a cost, and that cost was the official recognition of the dismantlement of the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Japanese Empire, with the Soviets installing pro-Soviet countries all across Japan's former empire, with communist support being much higher than in our timeline because the people would see the Soviets as the liberators. Although in Africa, the colonies have been recognized as independent, in reality, no borders are actually recognized because it's impossible to create any. During World War II, the Soviets funded every single revolutionary movement possible, which worked on deterring the British, but resulted in the rise of thousands of warlords across Africa, making it look more like China did before World War II, except even worse, and completely unpredictable as to what it would look like. Speaking of China, they will come out of the war fully unified, and pretty soon after the war ends, it will only be a matter of time before whatever resistance movements are left are squandered. Taiwan will be transferred to the PPC, and Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and Hokkaido Island will be annexed by the Soviets, and Japan will gain a pro-Soviet communist regime. As for America, with no restoration of Denmark, they will eventually annex Greenland into the country, and Iceland will end up becoming a protectorate that is heavily militarized by America to defend them against the Soviets. Last of all, whatever small island territories that the Europeans controlled around the world would be divided, with the Canadians and the Americans getting everything in the Americas, the Soviets getting everything in Europe and in Africa and Oceania and Asia. Last things to note are that the north of the Middle East are unified into one communist country, and the Suez Canal is annexed by the Soviets, and that concludes the Treaty of Moscow. With the war ending, America and the Soviets begin to consolidate their influence. In Europe, millions of British citizens leave their home island for a new beginning in Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, or Newfoundland, as well as millions of other Europeans who flee for the free world, while many stay behind to fight desperate guerrilla wars against the communists. With America protecting what's left of the free world, the Soviets growing in power every day, and the birth of a new warlord version of Africa, a new world order has been formed, and a new battleground is set to be fought in an alternate Cold War between capitalism and communism. And that is where I'm going to end this scenario for now.